The ground burned like iron beneath Jacob Hale's cheek. Heat pressed down on him from every direction, thick and merciless, stealing the air from his lungs one shallow breath at a time. His horse lay several yards away, motionless, its dark shape already beginning to blur at the edges of his vision. Jacob tried to push himself up, but his arms trembled violently and gave out. Sand filled his mouth. His canteen was empty, his lips split and bleeding, and the sun hung overhead like an executioner that had all the time in the world. Somewhere beyond the shimmering horizon, buzzards circled, patient and certain. Jacob knew that sound. He had heard it before, hovering over other men who thought they could outrun the desert. This time, it was waiting for him. He closed his eyes, fighting the urge to surrender, unaware that someone was already watching him from the rocks above, deciding whether he was worth saving. Hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're watching from. Now, let's continue with the story. Jacob Hale had never believed in fate. Men like him didn't have the luxury. Fate was something preachers talked about and gamblers blamed when the cards turned against them. What Jacob believed in was distance, grit, and the stubborn refusal to lie down just because the world had decided it was finished with you. That belief was the only thing keeping him conscious as the desert clawed at his senses. Somewhere in the haze between waking and blackout, a shadow moved across him. At first, Jacob thought it was a cloud, a cruel joke in a sky that hadn't known mercy in weeks. But the shadow lingered, steady and deliberate. He forced one eye open. A woman stood a few paces away, her boots planted firmly in the sand, her posture straight despite the heat. She was white, her skin weathered by sun and wind, her light hair pulled back tightly beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She didn't rush to him. She didn't kneel or speak. She simply watched. From her vantage point, Eleanor Whitmore took in every detail with practiced precision. The man's breathing was shallow but steady. His hands, though trembling, were calloused. Working hands, not the soft palms of a drifter who'd never earned his keep. His revolver was still strapped to his hip, untouched. Even now, half dead, he hadn't let it go. That mattered. She had learned long ago that desperation made liars of most people. The desert stripped that away. Out here, there was only truth. Jacob tried to speak, but the word died in his throat. His tongue felt like leather. He swallowed, then dragged himself forward an inch, clawing toward the thin sliver of shade cast by a rock. The movement was pathetic and brave all at once. Eleanor watched him do it again, and again. That was when she made her decision. 2 hours later, Jacob drifted back into consciousness, to the rhythmic creak of leather and the dull ache of movement. His body swayed, every muscle screaming in protest. He was draped awkwardly across a saddle, secured by a rope he didn't remember being tied. Each step of the horse sent a jolt of pain through him, but pain meant he was alive. They traveled in silence. Eleanor rode ahead, her posture relaxed but alert, her eyes constantly scanning the land. She did not speak to him, did not offer reassurance. She had given him water sparingly, enough to keep him alive, but not enough to dull his awareness. Survival, she believed, was a lesson best learned fully awake. By the time they reached the settlement, the sun was bleeding into the horizon, staining the sky copper and red. Jacob barely registered the crude buildings arranged in a loose semicircle against the rocky outcropping. What he did notice, what he felt instantly, were the eyes. They were watching him. Men, women, a few children, all pausing in their tasks to stare at the stranger slumped on Eleanor's horse. Their expressions ranged from curiosity to open hostility. No one smiled. No one waved. Eleanor dismounted smoothly and gestured for two men to help her. They did so reluctantly, lifting Jacob with minimal care and carrying him into a small wooden structure that smelled of dust and herbs. They laid him on a narrow cot and stepped back, as if afraid his presence alone might contaminate the space. When Jacob woke again, the air was cooler. A lantern burned softly near the wall. His throat no longer felt like it was closing in on itself. He turned his head and winced. Eleanor sat on a stool near the door. Up close, Jacob could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps in her mid-30s. Lines etched the corners of her eyes, not from age but from responsibility. This was a woman who carried weight, real weight, every waking hour. "You're not dead," she said calmly. "That means you're stronger than you look." Her voice was even, unadorned. Not unkind, but not gentle either. Jacob swallowed. "Feels debatable," he rasped. She regarded him for a moment, then stood. "You're in Whitmore's Crossing. You were found 3 miles south near the Badlands. Another hour out there and you wouldn't have made it." Jacob absorbed that slowly. "Why?" he asked. "Why help me?" Eleanor's expression didn't change. "I haven't helped you yet." She moved toward the door and paused, one hand resting on the frame. "Rest. You'll be expected to stand tomorrow." With that, she left. Over the next 2 days, Jacob learned what it meant to be tolerated rather than welcomed. Food appeared, always placed just out of reach, forcing him to move for it. Water was rationed carefully. No one spoke to him unless necessary, and even then, their words were clipped, guarded. He noticed things as his strength returned. The settlement was small, barely a dozen adults. There were more women than men. The children stayed close to the center, watched constantly. Everything was orderly, efficient, as if chaos had been beaten back through sheer discipline. And always, there was Eleanor. She observed from a distance, intervening only when necessary. When one man, tall, lean, with sharp eyes, openly complained about Jacob's presence, Eleanor silenced him with a single look. The man, Samuel Crow, did not hide his resentment. He simply stored it away. On the 3rd morning, Eleanor came for Jacob herself. "Walk," she said, nodding toward the path that led up into the rocks. Jacob obeyed. Each step was a negotiation with pain, but he forced himself forward. Eleanor matched his pace, offering no help. When he finally stopped, bracing himself against a stone, she studied him as she had in the desert. "You didn't quit," she said. It wasn't praise. It was a statement of fact. That night, Jacob lay awake listening to the wind move through the settlement. He felt it then, the certainty that his survival was not an accident. Eleanor had not pulled him from the desert out of kindness. She was measuring him, and whatever she was deciding would change the rest of his life. Somewhere beyond the darkened buildings, Samuel Crow watched the same stars with a very different expression, already convinced that the stranger in their midst was a threat that needed to be dealt with, one way or another. The desert, Jacob would soon learn, was not the most dangerous thing he had survived. Jacob Hale woke before dawn, not because someone called his name, but because the silence had changed. The night wind that had howled through Whitmore's Crossing since his arrival had softened, settling into a low, uneasy stillness. It was the kind of quiet that made a man feel watched, even when no one was in sight. He lay still on the narrow cot, eyes open, listening to the distant creak of wood and the faint shuffle of footsteps beyond the walls. He was stronger now. Not strong enough to fight, not yet, but strong enough to stand without the room spinning. Strong enough to notice things. Whitmore's Crossing did not wake like a normal settlement. There was no casual chatter, no laughter drifting from open doors. People emerged from their homes already focused, already moving with purpose. Every motion seemed measured, rehearsed by years of necessity. Jacob realized quickly that nothing here was wasted. Time, words, or effort. When he stepped outside, the cold morning air cut through his shirt, sharp and bracing. A few heads turned in his direction, then turned away just as quickly. He felt their judgment like a physical weight pressing against his shoulders. To them, he was still the outsider pulled half dead from the desert, a risk they hadn't asked for. Eleanor stood near the center of the settlement, speaking quietly with Margaret Boone, an older woman whose gray hair was pulled into a severe bun. Margaret's hands were busy sorting dried herbs, but her eyes never stopped watching the people around her. She noticed Jacob the moment he appeared. Margaret leaned closer to Eleanor and murmured something Jacob couldn't hear. Eleanor followed her gaze, meeting Jacob's eyes briefly before returning her attention to the conversation. The exchange was subtle, but Jacob felt it land. He wasn't invisible here. Far from it. Samuel Crow made no effort to hide his hostility. He approached Jacob later that morning near the water trough, his tall frame blocking the sun just enough to cast a shadow across Jacob's boots. Samuel's face was hard, angular, the kind of face shaped by disappointment that had nowhere to go. His hand rested casually near the knife at his belt. Not a threat exactly, but not an accident either. "You planning on staying?" Samuel asked. Jacob kept his voice calm. "Wasn't aware I'd been invited." A few people nearby slowed their work, pretending not to listen. Samuel's mouth twitched. "This isn't a place for drifters." "Then you're welcome to point me back to the desert," Jacob replied evenly. For a moment, Samuel looked like he might say more, might push the conversation into something uglier. Then Eleanor's voice cut through the tension. "That will be enough." She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't needed to. The authority in it was absolute. Samuel stepped back, his jaw tightening. He didn't argue, but when he turned away, the look he gave Jacob promised that this wasn't finished. Eleanor walked closer, stopping just far enough away to maintain distance. "You're expected to work," she said. "If you can't, say so now." Jacob nodded. "Just tell me where." She pointed toward a stack of weathered boards near the edge of the settlement. "Repair the south fence. It won't hold through another storm." He did as he was told. The work was slow, painful. His hands shook at first, muscles protesting every lift and hammer strike. But Jacob had built fences before. He knew wood, knew how to coax strength out of tired materials. As the hours passed, his movements grew steadier, more confident. People watched, always from the corners of their eyes, never directly. He noticed that no one offered help, but no one interfered either. That, he suspected, was Eleanor's doing. By midday, the sun climbed high, and sweat soaked through his shirt. When Jacob finally stepped back from the repaired section of fence, Margaret Boone appeared beside him with a tin cup of water. She didn't smile, but she didn't withhold it either. "You work like a man who's had to fix his own mistakes," she said quietly. Jacob took the cup. "Seems to be a habit." Margaret studied him for a long moment. "Habits can be useful, or dangerous. Depends who they serve." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away. That afternoon, Eleanor called the settlement together. It wasn't announced, but everyone seemed to know. They gathered near the central fire pit, forming a loose circle. Jacob stayed at the edge, unsure if he belonged inside it. Eleanor stood at the center, posture straight, gaze steady. "We are fewer than we were," she said plainly. "We all know this. What we don't know is whether we intend to survive it or simply wait for it to finish us." Murmurs rippled through the group. Samuel folded his arms, his expression dark. "This man," Eleanor continued, gesturing toward Jacob without looking at him, "is not here by accident. I found him dying. I chose to bring him back." Samuel spoke up. "You don't get to decide that alone." Eleanor turned to face him. "I already did." Silence followed, heavy and tense. "This doesn't make him one of us," Eleanor went on. "Not yet. He earns that or he leaves. But until that decision is made, he is under my protection." Jacob felt the weight of every eye on him then. Protection was not the same as acceptance. If anything, it made him more dangerous in their eyes. The meeting broke apart slowly, people dispersing in tight groups, voices low. Jacob remained where he was, uncertain what to do next. Eleanor approached him once the others had gone. "You handled Crow well," she said. Jacob shrugged. "Didn't seem like the kind of man who appreciates being handled." "He doesn't," Eleanor agreed, "which is why you should be careful." She studied him, really studied him, as if aligning what she'd seen in the desert with what she was seeing now. "You don't ask many questions." "I've learned questions make people nervous." A faint smile flickered across her face, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "You'll have questions soon enough." That night, Jacob sat alone near the edge of the settlement, watching the firelight dance against the buildings. He felt the tension in the air, the unspoken division his presence had created. Samuel Crow stood with two other men a short distance away, their conversation hushed but intense. Jacob didn't need to hear the words to understand the intent. Somewhere inside one of the homes, a child laughed, a brief, bright sound that cut through the unease. Jacob followed it with his eyes, watching Eleanor step out into the light, her expression softening as she looked toward the sound. In that moment, he understood something essential. This place wasn't just clinging to survival, it was afraid of disappearing. And Eleanor Whitmore hadn't saved him to be kind. She had saved him because she was running out of time, and he was about to become part of a choice far bigger than either of them had spoken aloud. The morning Eleanor chose to speak to Jacob alone came without ceremony, no summons, no warning. He was repairing a loose shutter on one of the outer buildings when he felt her presence before he heard her voice. She had a way of doing that, entering a space so deliberately that the air itself seemed to adjust around her. "Come with me," she said. Jacob set the hammer down and followed without a word. They walked past the edge of Whitmore's crossing, along a narrow path that wound upward into the rocks. The settlement shrank behind them, its sounds fading until there was only wind and the crunch of boots on gravel. Eleanor stopped at a flat overlook where the land dropped away into miles of dry valleys and sun-bleached stone. "This is why we're here," she said, gesturing toward the horizon. "Far enough from the roads, far enough from the towns, close enough to water when there is any." Jacob studied the land. It was harsh, unforgiving, but he could see the logic in it. "And far enough that no one comes looking." Eleanor nodded. "Exactly." She didn't speak again for a long moment. Jacob sensed that whatever she intended to say wasn't meant to be rushed. When she finally turned to face him, Her expression was stripped of its usual reserve. Not softer, but more honest. "You know you aren't welcome," she said. "Not by most of them." Jacob met her gaze. "I've noticed." "Good," she replied. "Then we won't waste time pretending otherwise." She crossed her arms, eyes never leaving his. "You were found because I was already looking. Not for you specifically, but for someone like you." Jacob felt a tightening in his chest. That's a dangerous thing to admit. So is pretending this place can survive on hope alone. Eleanor turned back toward the land. Whitmore's Crossing used to hold 50 people. Families, children, men who stayed, women who didn't bury more babies than they raised. Her voice remained steady, but Jacob heard the strain beneath it. Now there are 14 adults and 5 children. Every year, fewer. The young men leave. The women stay, because someone has to hold what's left together. Jacob said nothing. He had learned when silence mattered. "The bloodlines are thinning," Eleanor continued. "People marry cousins, or don't marry at all. Children are born weak. Some don't survive their first winter. Others never take a breath." She turned back to him then, eyes sharp. "This isn't about comfort. It's about time. We are running out of it." The pieces began to settle into place, heavy and undeniable. "And you think I'm the solution?" "I think you are a possibility," Eleanor corrected. "There's a difference." Jacob let out a slow breath. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," she said. "I watched you when you thought you were alone. Dying men don't pretend. They reveal." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the faint scar along her jaw, the evidence of a life that had not been gentle. "You didn't pray. You didn't scream. You tried to survive. That matters." Jacob swallowed. "And if I say no?" Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Then you leave." She reached into her coat and produced a folded scrap of paper, pressing it into his hand. "Directions to the nearest town. 2 days' ride if you're healthy. 3 if you're not." Jacob looked at the paper, then back at her. "And if I stay?" Her gaze hardened. "Then you accept what that means." She gestured back toward the settlement. "This isn't about me taking a husband. It's about rebuilding what's dying. There are other women here. Women who deserve families, futures, children who don't fade out of existence because no one was willing to do what was necessary." Jacob felt the weight of it settle over him like the desert heat. "You're asking me to give up everything." "I'm asking you to choose," Eleanor said. "That's not the same thing." They stood in silence, the wind pulling at their coats, the land stretching endlessly around them. Jacob thought of the road, of towns that never lasted, of work that ended as soon as it began. He thought of the children's laughter he'd heard the night before, fragile and rare. "I need time," he said. Eleanor inclined her head. "You have until dawn tomorrow." When they returned to Whitmore's Crossing, the atmosphere had shifted. It was subtle, but Jacob felt it immediately. Conversations stopped when he passed. Samuel Crow watched him openly now, no longer bothering with pretense. His gaze followed Jacob like a shadow. That evening, Margaret Boone found Jacob near the fire. She lowered herself onto a log beside him with a soft grunt, hands folded in her lap. "She spoke to you?" Margaret said. Jacob nodded. "She did." Margaret studied the flames. "Eleanor carries more than she lets on. This place exists because she refuses to let it die quietly." "And the others?" Jacob asked. "They're afraid," Margaret replied simply. "Of change, of loss, of what happens if this fails." Jacob glanced toward Samuel, who stood nearby with 2 men, their voices low. Some of them seem afraid of me. Margaret met his eyes. Fear often wears the mask of anger. That night, Jacob didn't sleep. He walked the perimeter of the settlement, thoughts circling endlessly. Every path led back to the same question: stay and become something he never imagined. Leave and carry the weight of what he'd refused for the rest of his life. Just before dawn, he sensed movement behind him. Samuel stepped out of the shadows, blocking the path. His expression was tight, controlled. "You should leave," Samuel said quietly. Jacob didn't reach for his weapon. "That's not your decision." Samuel's jaw clenched. "If you stay, people will get hurt." Jacob met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Seems to me people are already hurting." For a moment, Samuel looked like he might strike him. Instead, he leaned in close. "You don't belong here." Jacob held his ground. "Neither did I belong in the desert. Didn't stop me from surviving." Samuel stepped back, eyes cold. "Dawn's coming. Make the right choice." As Samuel disappeared into the darkness, Jacob felt it then, the certainty that whatever decision he made would not end quietly. Eleanor's offer wasn't just a crossroads, it was a spark, and sparks, in places this dry, had a way of becoming something far more dangerous. The confrontation did not wait for Jacob's answer. It came just after sunrise, when the air was still cool enough to lie. Jacob was carrying a crate of tools toward the south fence when he sensed the shift in the settlement, the subtle tightening, the way voices dropped, the way movement slowed without stopping. He had learned enough by now to recognize the warning signs. Whitmore's crossing was holding its breath. Samuel Crow stepped into his path. He wasn't alone. Two men stood a few paces behind him, close enough to intervene, far enough to deny intent. Their faces were blank, unreadable. Witnesses, not participants. Jacob set the crate down carefully, keeping his hands visible. He did not look for Eleanor. If she was watching, she would not interfere unless the rules were broken. He understood that now. "You've had your time," Samuel said, voice low. "Too much of it." Jacob met his gaze. "I wasn't aware there was a schedule." Samuel's mouth twitched, humorless. "You know exactly what this is." "I know what you want it to be," Jacob replied. "That doesn't make it the same thing." A few people lingered at the edges of the square, pretending to work. Margaret Boone stood near the fire pit, her posture rigid, eyes sharp. Children had been ushered inside. The space felt deliberate, cleared without announcement. Samuel stepped closer. "This place isn't yours to fix." Jacob felt the old instinct rise, the one that had kept him alive in towns where men vanished for less. He did not feed it. "I'm not trying to take anything." "That's the problem," Samuel snapped. "You don't even see what you're taking." Jacob inhaled slowly. "Then say it." Samuel hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. It was enough. "You don't belong here," Samuel said. "And if you stay, people will get hurt." Jacob nodded once. "I was warned." Samuel's hand moved. It wasn't fast. It wasn't dramatic. It was practiced. His fingers closed around the knife at his belt, drawing it halfway free. Not an attack. A declaration. Jacob did not reach for his gun. He stepped back instead, angling his body, keeping distance between them. "This doesn't end the way you think it does." Samuel smiled thinly. "It ends the way it needs to." The knife cleared its sheath. The sound was sharp, unmistakable. A line had been crossed. Jacob moved. He lunged sideways, kicking sand into Samuel's face. The move bought him a heartbeat, just enough to close the distance before the blade could find him. Samuel cursed, swinging wildly. Jacob caught his wrist, twisting hard, forcing the knife away from his body. Pain exploded through his arm as Samuel drove a knee into his ribs. They went down hard. The world narrowed to heat and breath and impact. Jacob rolled, barely avoiding the knife as it slashed through the space where his throat had been. He grabbed Samuel's forearm with both hands, leveraging his weight, forcing the blade into the dirt. Samuel was stronger than he looked, younger, faster, desperate. A punch connected with Jacob's jaw, snapping his head back. Stars burst behind his eyes. He tasted blood. Jacob responded with his elbow, driving it into Samuel's shoulder. Bone met bone. Samuel grunted, grip loosening just enough for Jacob to wrench the knife free and throw it aside. The blade skidded across the ground, stopping inches from one of the watching men's boots. Neither man reached for it. Samuel surged forward, hands bare now, rage stripping away restraint. He went for Jacob's throat. Jacob ducked, wrapped an arm around Samuel's torso, and drove him backward. They crashed into the fence, wood splintering under the force. Jacob felt the world tilt as Samuel tried to throw him. He shifted his weight, remembering lessons learned in fights that had never been fair. He hooked his foot behind Samuel's ankle and twisted. Samuel went down hard. Jacob didn't press the advantage immediately. He backed away, breathing hard, hands raised. He could have ended it then. He chose not to. "Enough," Jacob said. Samuel scrambled to his feet, blood running from a cut along his brow. His eyes burned with something darker than anger. He charged again. This time, Jacob was ready. He sidestepped, caught Samuel's momentum, and sent him sprawling into the dirt. Samuel lay there, chest heaving, staring up at the sky. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Eleanor stepped forward. She had been there the entire time. She stood between them, her presence a wall. She did not look at Jacob. Her eyes were on Samuel. "Stand down," she said. Samuel struggled to his feet, wiping blood from his face. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The fury was still there, but something else had crept in beneath it. Recognition. Reluctant respect. Eleanor turned then, finally, to Jacob. She studied him with the same expression she'd worn in the desert. Appraising, unsentimental. "You could have killed him," she said. "I didn't," Jacob replied. "That was a choice." "So was pulling a knife," Jacob said quietly. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once. Not approval, acknowledgement. "This is over," she said to the gathered crowd. "For now." People dispersed slowly, tension bleeding out of the space like heat after a storm. Samuel walked away without another word, his shoulders rigid, his back straight. The men who had stood with him followed, silent. Jacob stood alone, adrenaline fading, pain settling into every joint. He hadn't noticed Eleanor approach until she was standing beside him. "You've made enemies," she said. "I had those already." She studied the broken fence. "You didn't fight to dominate. You fought to survive." Jacob wiped blood from his mouth. "There's a difference." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "and everyone here saw it." That night, the settlement felt different, not quieter, not calmer, sharper. Jacob sat near the fire, ribs aching, jaw swollen. Margaret Boone brought him a cloth and a small tin of salve. She pressed them into his hands without comment. "Thank you," Jacob said. Margaret met his eyes. "You showed restraint. That matters." Across the square, Samuel sat alone, staring into the dark. He did not look at Jacob. Eleanor stood at the edge of the firelight, watching both men with equal intensity. When Jacob finally looked up, their eyes met. The question she had asked him still hung between them. Stay and accept what it means. Leave and let this place fade. Jacob realized then that his decision was no longer his alone. Whatever he chose would ripple outward, touching everyone in Whitmore's Crossing. The test had been set, and the harder ones were still to come. Time did what arguments could not. Weeks turned into months, marked not by dates but by calloused hands, repaired roofs, and the slow shift in how people looked at Jacob Hale. He stopped being watched constantly and started being expected. When something broke, someone handed him tools without asking. When a fence leaned under the weight of wind and age, Jacob was already there before Eleanor gave the order. He learned the land the way Whitmore's Crossing demanded, by listening, by failing quietly, by paying attention. Eleanor did not coddle him. She paired him with different people each day, rotating him through tasks that tested more than strength. He learned where the water ran shallow beneath stone, how to ration grain when supply wagons didn't come, how to read the sky for storms that never quite delivered rain. She watched from a distance, intervening only when he was about to make a mistake that would cost more than pride. At first, the work was punishment. Then it became purpose. The children changed first. They stopped staring at him like he might disappear. A boy named Caleb began trailing him around the settlement, asking questions about horses and guns and places beyond the hills. Jacob answered carefully, aware that curiosity was fragile here. He did not promise anything he couldn't deliver. Margaret Boone noticed everything. One evening, as Jacob stacked firewood near the central pit, she joined him without announcement. "You're staying," she said, not as a question. Jacob paused, then nodded. "Seems that way." Margaret studied his face. "Staying is easy. Being useful is harder." "I'm trying," Jacob said. Margaret's lips twitched. "We've seen." Samuel Crow did not soften as quickly. He avoided Jacob when he could, spoke only when necessary. But there were moments, brief, unguarded, when Jacob caught him watching with something close to grudging acknowledgement. During a supply run to the river, Samuel slipped on loose rock, nearly losing his footing. Jacob caught him without thinking, hauling him back before the ground gave way. They stood there for a long moment, hands still locked, breath heavy. Samuel pulled away first. "Don't think this changes anything," he said. Jacob met his gaze. "Wasn't planning on it." But it did change something. Eleanor noticed the shift long before anyone named it. The tension that had once felt sharp enough to cut had dulled into something more manageable. People still disagreed. They always would. But the edges were less bloody. As Jacob integrated, Eleanor allowed herself small changes. She stood closer when they spoke. Her voice softened when no one else was around. She trusted him with decisions that affected more than one person. It was not intimacy yet. It was something sturdier. One night, after a long day repairing storm damage, they sat together near the fire while the settlement slept. The stars stretched overhead, bright and indifferent. "You're different now," Eleanor said quietly. Jacob considered that. "So are you." She nodded. "I've had to be." He glanced at her, saw the exhaustion she rarely showed. "You don't carry it alone anymore." Eleanor looked at him then, really looked. That was never the plan. Plans changed. The first true test came with the drought. The spring ran thin, the water tasting of iron and dust. Eleanor rationed without apology. Jacob took the hardest assignments, hauling water farther than anyone else, refusing extra portions. People noticed. They remembered. When a child fell ill, Jacob stayed awake through the night, fetching Margaret when the fever spiked, holding a lamp steady while she worked. The child survived. That mattered more than words. Slowly, Whitmore's crossing shifted from tolerating Jacob to depending on him. It was inevitable that feelings followed. Eleanor resisted longer than she intended. She had buried a husband, buried certainty, buried the idea that her heart had any say left in her choices. But one evening, as Jacob returned from a hunt with Samuel and 2 others, empty-handed but uninjured, she felt the tension in her chest ease simply because he had come back. That frightened her more than anything. She asked him to walk with her beyond the settlement, to the ridge overlooking the valley, the same place she had shown him months ago. "You stayed," she said. "I chose," Jacob replied. Eleanor folded her arms, staring at the horizon. "This path doesn't leave room for half measures." Jacob stepped closer. "I'm not afraid of the work." "I'm not talking about work." She turned then, the vulnerability in her eyes raw and unguarded. "Once this moves forward, it can't be undone." Jacob didn't answer immediately. He thought of the road he'd left behind, of the man he had been. He thought of the children laughing near the fire, of the land that no longer felt like an enemy. "I know," he said. Eleanor reached out, hesitated, then rested her hand against his chest. The gesture was steady, deliberate. "If you stay with me," she said, "it won't be just for me." Jacob covered her hand with his own. "I understand." The settlement felt the change before it was announced. Eleanor's posture shifted. Her decisions came with a quiet certainty that spread outward. When she finally spoke to the elders, Margaret included, there were no raised voices, just nods, acceptance tempered with caution. Samuel listened in silence. That night, as Jacob lay awake, he understood that the final choice was no longer theoretical. It was real, immediate, and it would bind him to this place in ways he could not escape. Outside, Eleanor stood alone beneath the stars, one hand resting lightly against her stomach, not in certainty yet, but in awareness. Something had begun, something fragile and powerful. Whitmore's crossing did not know it yet, but the future was already shifting beneath their feet. And the last test, one that would demand more than strength or restraint, was drawing closer. Dawn broke gently over Whitmore's crossing, the light spilling across the valley in soft shades of gold instead of the harsh glare the land was known for. Jacob Hale stood near the edge of the settlement, watching the day arrive with a stillness he had not possessed when he first came here. The man who had crawled through the desert months ago felt distant now, like a story told about someone else. Behind him, the settlement was already awake. Children moved between the buildings, their voices low but lively. Smoke rose from cook fires. Life continued, not desperately, not quietly, but steadily. That alone felt like a victory. Eleanor stepped out from her home and joined him without a word. She stood close enough that their shoulders almost touched. For a moment, neither spoke. They did not need to. "It's time," she said at last. Jacob nodded. He had known this moment would come. The choice had been made long ago. Today was only its shape becoming visible to everyone else. The gathering happened as it always did, without ceremony, without fanfare. The people of Whitmore's crossing formed a circle near the fire pit, some standing, some seated, all attentive. Margaret Boone stood near Eleanor, her presence lending weight to what was about to be said. Samuel Crow stood across the circle, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice carried easily, calm and assured. "This place exists because we chose to keep it alive," she said. "Not because it was easy, because it mattered." She gestured to Jacob. Jacob Hale chose to stay when he could have left. He worked beside us. He bled beside us. He did not take more than he gave. A murmur rippled through the group, quiet but approving. "I have chosen him," Eleanor continued. "Not for comfort, not for tradition, for the future." Silence followed, heavy and expectant. Jacob stepped forward then, heart steady. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence was answer enough. Margaret Boone broke the quiet. "We have seen what he is," she said, "and what he is willing to become." One by one, the elders nodded. Samuel's gaze flicked toward Jacob, then back to Eleanor. For a long moment, Jacob thought he might speak, might challenge the decision one final time. Instead, Samuel exhaled slowly and looked away. Acceptance did not come with warmth. It came with restraint, and that was enough. Life moved forward. The seasons shifted subtly, marked by cooler nights and a sky that hinted at rain but rarely delivered. Jacob settled fully into his place, not as a guest, not as a novelty, but as part of the foundation. He trained with the men, hunted farther out, repaired what could not wait. He learned the rhythms of the settlement until they matched his own. Eleanor changed too. She allowed herself moments of rest. She laughed more often, though quietly. She leaned into Jacob's presence without apology. At night, they spoke of things beyond survival, of what Whitmore's Crossing might become if it endured. The news came without spectacle. Eleanor told Jacob one evening as they sat together, the firelight flickering between them. She did not smile at first. She watched his face carefully, as if bracing for doubt. "I'm with child," she said simply. Jacob felt the world pause. He reached for her hands, grounding himself in the reality of her. "Are you sure?" Eleanor nodded. "I am." For a moment neither spoke. Then Jacob laughed softly, a sound of disbelief and awe. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if the future itself might slip away if he loosened his grip. The settlement felt the change almost immediately. There was no announcement, no declaration. Word spread the way it always did, quietly, from one conversation to the next. Faces softened, shoulders eased. The children sensed it most clearly, their laughter growing louder, freer. Eleanor was not the only one. Two other women, strong and capable, stepped forward in time. Their choices were not made lightly. Jacob did not claim them. They chose him, and Eleanor stood beside those decisions without jealousy or doubt. This was not about possession. It was about continuation. Samuel watched all of it with guarded eyes. One evening, as Jacob repaired a broken hinge near the outer fence, Samuel approached. He stood silently for a moment before speaking. "You stayed," Samuel said. "I did." Samuel nodded once. "You didn't have to." Jacob met his gaze. "Neither did you." A corner of Samuel's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile. "Don't make me regret letting this stand." Jacob extended a hand. After a brief hesitation, Samuel shook it. It was not friendship. It was peace. The first child was born on a night when the stars burned bright and close. Margaret Boone guided the birth with steady hands and practiced calm. When the cry finally came, strong and undeniable, the settlement exhaled as one. Jacob held Eleanor afterward, their foreheads pressed together, the weight of what they had done settling into something like wonder. More children followed in the months after. Whitmore's crossing changed in small, undeniable ways. Repairs became improvements. Plans stretched farther into the future. The settlement no longer felt like it was bracing for an end, but preparing for a continuation. Jacob often stood at the edge of the valley now, watching the land with different eyes. The desert was still unforgiving. It always would be. But it no longer felt empty. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in warm colors, Eleanor joined him. She placed his hand gently over her belly, where new life stirred. "You gave up your old life," she said softly. Jacob shook his head. "I found a reason to live it." Eleanor smiled then, truly smiled. So did we. Behind them, the sounds of Whitmore's crossing carried on. Voices, footsteps, laughter, proof that the choice they had made had mattered. The desert wind moved through the valley, carrying those sounds outward, as if daring the land itself to remember them. And for the first time in a long while, the future did not feel fragile. It felt real. I hope you enjoyed this story. Subscribe to my channel so you don't miss touching stories. Leave a like and then comment below what you thought of the emotional stories. See you in the next video.